we continue on with risk monitoring and reporting. So ultimately, what we're doing is we're looking at the risk assessment, we're looking at our mitigation strategies, and we're trying to determine, are we operating within that acceptable level? How often should we monitor, or let me say this, how often should we go back and reevaluate our controls? So this is a little different than how often should we monitor. How often we go back and do a controls assessment. We need to do that at least once per year, or in the event of a major change, right? So I implement controls, great. They meet their objectives, great. Still, at the end of a year, I have to go back and see, are these controls still the best that we have to mitigate our risks appropriately based on cost-benefit analysis? If all I do is say, well, we haven't had a compromise, so it must be working, that's not a risk-based decision. Just because you haven't had a compromise doesn't mean one won't happen tomorrow or the week after or whatever. As a matter of fact, one of the things I was talking with a friend about is I am often just shocked to find that there are still organizations that are running web security for their wireless networks. Now, I'm not saying that's commonplace, but if you go out and get a cable router and you look on the side of that router, chances are very good you'll see a label that says WEP key, which means out of the box that router is going to use WEP to protect the wireless network. What? Well, why? Because regardless of how old your equipment is, you will support WEP. So ease of use. Well, ease of use, fine, but I'm not running an 802.11b wireless device from the 1990s, right? I've got, a system in place that can support WPA2. So if all I do is say, well, WEP hasn't been broken yet, must be meeting its objectives, must be good enough, that's not risk management. Risk management says on a yearly basis, we go back and we say, okay, what are the threats today? Because the threats today are very different from the threats a year ago, from the threats 5 years ago. What's the probability and impact of a compromise? What are the mitigating strategies we have? Well, we have WEP, we have WPA, we have WPA2. Currently, WEP's the default, but you know what? It doesn't cost me a penny more to switch from WEP to WPA2. That's a no-brainer. But if all I had done is made my decision based on, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, well, I would have stayed in a very vulnerable position. So in addition to risk monitoring and reporting, we have to go back and reassess our solutions as well. But again, we continue to monitor. When we do talk about monitoring for risks, we want to know, are the risks that we anticipated materializing? And I'd like to know if a risk is going to materialize before it materializes so that I can implement my mitigation strategy. So one of the ways that we monitor risk, or one of the metrics we use, is something called the KRI, the Key Risk Indicator, KRI. And it's just an alert. It's a warning sign. You can kind of think of it as being able to identify a trigger. So a trigger doesn't cause the risk event, but it's a good indication that the risk event may materialize. So I indicated that bad weather or rain was going to be a risk associated with my picnic. It's going to threaten my picnic, if you will. So a key risk indicator might be dark clouds, thunder, and lightning. Doesn't guarantee that rain's coming, but it sure does make me say, hey, you guys, let's go ahead and move into the alternative facility that's indoors, right? So that I can avoid the loss. I can put that mitigation in before we suffer loss. So these key risk indicators are ultimately going to ideally give me time before the risk event materializes to address it and to minimize the losses associated with them. And if I manage my risks, I'm more likely to meet my business objectives. So some examples of things you might use as a KRI. So again, these have to match to business objectives. They have to be an indication that a risk that will impact the business is going to materialize. But, so maybe I'm concerned with third-party governance. and I'm concerned. I want to know if my vendors are on schedule or if they're negatively impacting my organizational performance. So I might set a key risk indicator for and monitor how many vendors are exceeding the threshold specified in their SLAs. Because ultimately, at some point, well, then, yeah, that's going to affect how my business operates. So show me if 20% of my vendors are exceeding their thresholds, and that means I'm going to step in and I'm going to implement some mitigation to get things back on track. How long does it take me to patch systems? If on average it's taking 6 months to patch systems, well, good Lord, how many how many vulnerabilities am I exposed to in that 6 month time between when a virus or malware comes out and when we actually patch for it, right? So these are just some examples of things that we want to look for that are going to be an indication that a risk is about to materialize. All this, again, looks within the risk context of the organization. So KRIs in a very risk-seeking environment, we're willing to take on a lot of risks. I may not have as many KRIs, but if we're a really risk-averse organization, I may have a lot of KRIs and I might have a lot of thresholds that are set very low. Okay? So KRIs are a way that I can I can get an indication that a risk event is likely to materialize. Again, that just sums them up. Early warning gives us kind of a view. When we look back, often we get these KRIs, this idea of a backward-looking view. Well, many times when a risk event materializes, we go, oh, if I had just seen this, right? A compromise. When I see 75 port scans from a specific IP address, well, that's an indication that somebody's knocking at the doors, right? So that's an indication that the risk of a compromise is going to get escalated. Well, when I see a compromise, sometimes I can go back and I can say, wow, here's something we missed. Let's make sure we add that as a KRI so that we don't miss it the next time. All right. So risk management process review. Okay. We assessed risk, which means we identified our threats and vulnerabilities, and we looked at, we identified our assets, figured out their value, looked at threats and vulnerabilities. We did risk assessment or risk analysis. We tried to get a value, qualitative or quantitative. Risk mitigation, we provided a treatment to those risks appropriate based on cost-benefit analysis. Then we continued to monitor for risk.